Hey guys, JR here. Today I'm just going to go over my version of the paper test method, as Clipper would call it. We're all pretty familiar with this method. It's how we first learn to level our beds with the knobs. It's a method of Z-axis probing, right? So effectively, the method is you put a piece of paper underneath the nozzle and you lower the Z-axis until you feel friction on the paper, and then you accept whatever that Z-axis value is for whatever the calibration you're doing is. And that could be calibrating your Z end stop position. That could be calibrating your Z offset for your probe. That could be, like I said, doing manual bed screw leveling. And that could also be generating and doing the manual probing for a manually calibrated bed mesh. And that is something that if you've ever done personally, you'll know is a headache. And the more samples you have per axis, the more samples you, the human, have to do, and thus the more opportunity for human error. And since obviously the more samples per axis, the longer it takes you, that can be very frustrating. So there is a better way than using paper, and that is to use feeler gauges or thickness gauges. And this is not a novel process or concept. People have been doing this on their 3D printers for a long time, but we're gonna take this a step further. But let me talk about the baseline way to use this first. So you want to take and get yourself a set of feeler gauges, because these are nice, precise thickness gauges that are made of metal and are non-compressible, unlike paper. So when your nozzle comes down and bites that metal, you're gonna feel it right away. And once you feel any amount of friction, you know, for one, you can't go any further, and two, that's your precise Z offset. So, typically, let me switch camera hands here, sorry about that. Typically what you would do is you would take your feeler gauge, and the thinner the gauge, the better. I'm not using an ideal thickness one right now, but you want to get it bent down to where it's flush with the bed, and you sort of just wave it back and forth underneath your nozzle as you're doing your test Z commands or adjusting your knobs or what have you. And you will feel the resistance as soon as it starts. And there you go. So this is already an improvement, and for $5 to $10, using this instead of paper is going to take you a long way. One note, if you're doing bed screw adjustment, there's a variable you should set called probe height to the thickness of your feeler gauge, and that will set the Z value of the nozzle up that high so you can fit the feeler gauge under there as it moves to each corner. Also, if you're using a feeler gauge for something like your probe Z offset calibration, you need to do your Z offset calibration with the thickness gauge or with the feeler gauge, and then once you save that value, add the thickness of this to that value, and it'll be dead on. So, one little tangent, if you want to nerd out like I have, you can take a micrometer, if you've got one or can afford one, which is heaps more accurate than your digital digital caliper, and you can measure this down to the thou or even half thou, and really precisely know what thickness your feeler gauge is. So how do we take this to the next level and make this even more precise and, dare I say, even borderline automatic probing, but still human controlled? Well, you're going to need one, two, three other things. So you're going to need this brass brush, you're going to need a multimeter, and you're going to need some alligator clip leads. And here's what you do. So you're going to heat up your nozzle, and you're just going to scrub that bad boy off. Get all the filament off, anything that would be on the nozzle, molten, carbonized filament, anything, get it off of there. And continue to scrub that at temp, and then turn off the heater and let it lower down while you continue to brass brush off any ooze, and that'll ensure that your nozzle is very clean once you are done. And now you're in a position where you can proceed to using the meter. So what we're going to do is put the meter in continuity mode, and one of these leads we're going to clip onto the body of the all of the feeler gauges. If you had this detached, you could obviously just clip it to the single feeler gauge. And then I'm going to take this other one and I'm going to clip it right on my X gantry plate here, because this has screws mounting the heatsink, and the heatsink is metallically attached to the heat brake, which is attached to the nozzle. So there is continuity from this plate down to the nozzle. So you should understand where we're going from here if you're playing along at home. And the idea is let me clip this on a little better. The idea is that you want to take your feeler gauge in the same way as before, get it under there, flat as can be, and then as you, and this is the tricky part, filming with, doing this with one hand and filming. Ooh. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to film this with one hand, but the idea is your feeler gauge is now a switch contact effectively, and once the nozzle gets down to it, it's gonna beep, and you don't even have to put any pressure on this. You're gonna know the instant that, you know, there's electrical continuity, and you're gonna have a much more precise and consistent Z offset from probing like that. So if you do a mesh with continuity and feeler gauges, it's gonna be about as close as, or about as best as you can get without having an actual, you know, automated probe like a BL Touch. But, you know, this is $5. Most people have a meter.